This is the third lecture on the topic of psychological disorders. And we left off talking about anxiety, some of the anxiety disorders. I want to begin this lecture talking about some of the explanations for anxiety disorder, and then move into a further discussion, further discussion about other kinds of anxieties like phobias and obsessive compulsive. So the thinking is that this irrational worry, it has both a either or, a cognitive aspect. Remember, cognitive is about thinking, as well as potentially a biological aspect. So certainly there is evidence that these disorders run in families. I can vividly remember my mother sitting in church worrying that her house was on fire, right? Did she turn off the coffee pot? Did she turn off the curling iron? Did she turn off the oven? Right? And so part of the idea is that we learn to worry about things that other people don't learn to worry about. So that would be the cognitive explanation, right? Well, that's one of those. So another cognitive explanation. I want to make sure I have this sort of right in the handout, is that we hyper-focus, or we're particularly sensitive to the things that are happening in our body. So some people, for instance, may notice their heartbeat, and other people don't notice their heartbeat. So for people that notice their heartbeat every time it speeds up or it skips a beat, they focus on that, perhaps irrationally, that they're very sensitive to changes in their body. And this hypersensitivity causes them to, like, I don't like the word overthink, but they focus on something to a point that it begins to interfere. So when you ruminate, and that's what rumination is you dwell, you think about it over and over and over again, and you just can't let it go. And for people that are prone to these panic attacks, which are primarily a biological thing, they focus more or irrationally on those physical changes in their body than, say, somebody else's. So that's one of the cognitive behavioralist explanation, is that every time your heart skips a beat, oh my gosh, I'm having a heart attack, I'm dying. And that anxiety that comes from thinking, oh my gosh, I'm having a heart attack from dying, causes the heart rate to beat faster. And so it becomes sort of a vicious cycle. Other one is what they call your triple vulnerability model. So that says, first of all, that you're biologically predisposed, that anxiety, because again, if we think about anxiety as a phenomena of the sympathetic nervous system, and the sympathetic nervous system is a part of your biological makeup, the same way you inherit your height, you would inherit your sympathetic nervous system, right? So we have this biological predisposition. We have a life where we don't feel like we have a whole lot of control. Things are just happening. Remember, we were talking about locus of control when we talked about stress. So we don't really have an internal locus of control. The world is just coming at us. We can't do anything about it, right? And then we're additionally hypersensitive to our physiological changes, and that makes us particularly sensitive or particularly vulnerable to developing some of these anxiety disorders. So one method of treatment might be to, when you notice these physiological things, to think about them, but then let them go. So acknowledge that, well, of course my heart's beating faster, I just ran up the steps, right? So that's what cognitive behavioral is, to think about things differently, so we have a different interpretation. Okay, phobias. Phobias are fun. If you follow the link in the chapter outline, I'll put it up in the class somewhere. I'll put it up in the Moodle. But there's a link to all the different kinds of phobias. Phobias are defined as a kind of anxiety, so they're irrational fear, but they're specific to objects or situations or activities. And you name it, there's a phobia about it. There's a phobia about nuns, about the number 8. There's a phobia, obviously, and then some of the more logical ones or more common ones. If you scoot down to the next slide, there's a box there, and those are the top 10 most common phobias in the United States. Things like spiders and the dark and heights, right? So there's a couple different theories, and this is the theory that I think makes the most sense about phobias. Because some of these phobias are so common, like they're nearly universal, that the idea is that we are biologically predisposed. So we are genetically inclined to fear certain things. And those things that we're genetically inclined to fear are the things that are potentially dangerous for us, like heights. Since we can't fly, that in order for our species to have survived as long as we have had to have learned very quickly that it was dangerous to be up high, right? So we pass on, and those of us who are afraid of, who have avoided heights out of fear, we pass on that genetic material to our children, and they've been afraid anyway. So it's the idea that this fear of heights or fear of the dark. Why would we be afraid of the dark? Cats aren't afraid of the dark because cats can see in the dark. We can't. We don't know what's dangerous. Fear of small spaces, claustrophobia, right? Well, small spaces could be very dangerous for us. You don't want to get stuck in small spaces. Anyway, so fear of spiders. Well, here's the thing. All spiders are venomous. They all have poison. The difference is that some of them are so small that they either can't bite you, can't get the poison in you, or it would take, to be swarmed by daddy long legs in order for you to actually become sick, right? So that's the biological predisposition. I want to move back up to the previous slide because I left off a couple things. Okay, so fear of certain specific phobias, right? Fear of certain specific, and then social phobia. So this is where I think we get agoraphobia confused with social anxiety. What social phobia is the fear of being judged, right? It's not social anxiety, right? But it's the fear of, I don't want to go out in public. I don't want to walk in front of people because I'm afraid they're going to judge me. And as my teenage daughter always says, they're more concerned about other people judging them than they are about judging you. Yeah, I hope that's true. Don't know. But that's what we mean by social phobia. And there's another really cool one that I like to show this video in class, and that's tryptophobia. I think that's how you pronounce it. But it's the fear of clusters of small holes. And this one is something called a social contagion. And I think social contagion, emotional contagion. But it's the idea that many of us don't know we even have it until we've heard about it, until somebody describes it. And I'll just make that video available for you and see if you have tryptophobia. I do have a touch of it. I have a touch of tryptophobia that is compounded by obsessive compulsive, because every semester when I talk about tryptophobia, this fear, it kind of, like I see these videos, you see these, especially the frog that lays the eggs in her back, it makes me kind of queasy. But then after I've talked about it, I feel this compulsion, this need to go out and look at all these pictures until I sort of get saturated, and then I can move on. Then I don't have to be quite so obsessed about it. Some of the other causes of phobia, one might be is that you've learned to be afraid of certain things. So I think, which one is that? I think that is observational learning. So I have a fear of ledges, not heights, but ledges. And I attribute this to, I believe I learned this through classical conditioning. And classical conditioning is when you've had a traumatic event and you develop a fear in response to that traumatic event. But this would have been when I was about in second grade, back in 1977. And we were on the playground, and that was before you had a lot of safety protocols on playgrounds. And there was a little boy in our class, his name was Dennis, and Dennis had some mobility issues. Well, what children would do is they're on the playground, there was a stairwell and leading, and it was all cement. And so children would walk around the edge, right, walk around the little wall, ledge around that stairwell, and, we would balance. Well, Dennis, who had mobility issues, he tried it one time, and he tried walking around the ledge. Well, Dennis fell over the ledge, and so, it's a whole floor. It's a stairwell. And all the children ran to the edges, and we all looked over. Well, I still have a memory of looking over and seeing Dennis, the bottom of the stairwell, with blood from his ears and his eyes. And ever since then, I don't like ledges. It's fear. I don't know if it's the fear of falling over the ledge, I don't know if it's the fear of what you might see when you look over the ledge, but I have a fear. It's not heights, but it's ledges, because those ledges can be really shallow, but I can still be afraid of them. Well, I believe that my son has I'm not that I don't, my son has a similar fear. And I think his fear came from a kind of observational learning, that when we would go camping when he was small and we would go Colorado camping, I would get really freaky deaky every time that there were ledges. And I can remember, like making him sit in the car with me because he couldn't get, and every time he get too far to the ledge, I'd pull him back. And I believe this is a kind of observational learning. He learned not through an experience, but through watching me, that he should stay away from ledges. The same way that a child might learn to be afraid of mice by watching their mother, there's a mouse in the kitchen, and so the kid learns to be afraid of mice, right? And then finally, operant conditioning is a kind of fear that we learn that certain things cause us fear, but if I stay back here, I won't experience that fear. So I simply have learned that if I go, I can't think of any good examples. Um, I've learned to avoid situations that give me anxiety. I cannot think of a good example of operant fear. Some of the other anxieties that are fun to talk about are phobias. It's always a fun classroom conversation. People are afraid of chickens. Actually, that's a fairly common one, or birds or rabbits. A lot of people are afraid of blood, but that would be a biological explanation too, because blood could be filled with all kinds of pathogens that might make you sick. Feces, vomit, some of those things are fairly common. But I'll put that link up, and you can see for yourself all the fun different phobias. I'm going to stop here, and in the next one, we'll come back and talk specifically about obsessive compulsive disorder.